The following is distributed by the Berean Call.
Chapter 17. Russia and the Coming Holocaust. The Soviet Union will sooner or later launch a massive assault upon Israel. This is one of the most widely held convictions in the world today. Although they hope it will not happen, and try not to think of it, millions of persons around the world, from Soviet foot soldiers in Afghanistan to Jewish lawyers in New York, from Christian housewives in Los Angeles to Jewish school children in Tel Aviv, from Arab diplomats at the United Nations to Dutch Reform ministers in South Africa, know with a strange certainty that this coming Holocaust is inevitable. The Kremlin has been plotting this for decades, and the Israelis have been preparing for it. So have the Arabs. Ever since the establishment in 1948 of the Jewish state of Israel, her Muslim neighbors have been determined to destroy her. For years, this was declared openly by all of the Arab leaders. Lately, however, in an attempt to build a better world image, the repeated vows of annihilation have been disguised as public relations rhetoric about Middle East peace plans and equitable resettlement of displaced Palestinians in their own autonomous state. Today, the PLO is the only group openly waving the old hate banner of non-recognition of Israel and pathological determination to kill or remove all Jews from Palestine. However, she carries this banner at the head of a procession that still includes most, if not all, Arab states following behind, while pretending not to notice. Most of us are only too happy to be deceived if the lie is something we want to believe. In spite of the overwhelming evidence of continuing torture, murder, and suppression of human rights, Westerners grasp any propaganda straw to imagine that the Soviets and other communist regimes have abandoned their goal of global conquest and are sincerely interested in mutual disarmament. This naivete, as much as greed, necessitated the recent hiring of 300 new agents and investigators by the U.S. Customs Service, quote, in an effort to staunch the flow of American high technology to the Soviet Union, a major source of both components for their own military systems and for manufacturing equipment with which to develop new systems, unquote. What blindness to sell an enemy the weapons he intends to use against you. That same blindness is why we underestimated the Ayatollah Khomeini and cannot admit today that Islam, now in a worldwide revival, is as determined as the Soviets to destroy Israel and conquer the world. Islamic expert Lance Lambert has said, quote, Islam has at its very heart a dogmatic belief that it must triumph. Ultimately, those who confess that Muhammad is not the prophet and that the Quran is not the final word of God, they are worthy of death. Westerners cannot conceive of nations that base their whole policy and program on Islamic theology. But that is precisely what is happening in Iran, Libya, and Saudi Arabia. It is the same thing that we witnessed in the rise of fascism in Italy with Benito Mussolini, or the rise of National Socialism in Germany with Adolf Hitler. It is not just ideological, it is theological. Muslims actually believe that their God has given them the oil weapon in order to finally win. Can you not see that Israel is an affront to Islam? A Jewish nation with a Jewish leadership and army is an obscenity in the eyes of Islam. That is why the Bible says there will be war after war, all centered upon those few square meters of land where the temple once stood, where now the mosques of Omar and Al-Aqsa stand. Is it not interesting that Syrian President Assad disarmed every PLO man that's gone into Syria? They know they are producing terrorists for the subversion of the whole free world. In this little, beautiful land of Lebanon, the PLO established a worldwide base for terrorism. The KGB World Center for Terrorism has been in Beirut, unquote. The Soviet-Arab partnership is a strange and hypocritical one. Their mutual hatred of Israel is temporarily made friends of convenience out of hardcore Marxist atheists and fanatical followers of the one God, Allah. The Kremlin hoped that with its backing the Arabs could destroy Israel. They could not. The wars of 1967 and 1973 made that clear. Now the Soviets know they must invade Israel themselves. It is only a matter of time until they do. A nuclear holocaust is coming. It will start with a coordinated Soviet-Arab attack upon Israel that will engulf the entire world. This invasion was foretold more than 2,500 years ago by Hebrew prophets who predicted the horrible consequences for Israel, the Soviets, and the whole earth. A long-standing prophetic interpretation. Critics insist that the widely held belief among Christians concerning Russia's coming attack upon Israel is a recent interpretation of vague Bible prophecies that is derived mainly from observation of current world events. On the contrary, based solely upon the Bible, evangelical Christians have held the view for centuries that Israel would possess its land once again in the last days, and there be attacked by a Russian-led confederacy of nations. The following excerpted analysis of Ezekiel 38 and 39, taken from a 6-volume commentary written in England by an Anglican priest about 1815, reveals that the very same interpretation that is commonly accepted among evangelicals today had already, at that early date nearly 170 years ago, been established for some time. Quote, "The prophecy without question relates to the latter ages of the world when Israel shall return into their own land. Rosh signifies those inhabitants of Scythia, from whence the Russians derive their name. This formidable invasion of the land of Israel, God will defeat it. The Persians, that is Iran and Afghanistan, from the east, the Ethiopians from the south, the Moors, or Libyans, from the west, shall join with them in this onset towards the end of the world, after the general restoration of the Jewish nation." Unquote. In spite of the fact that Israel did not exist and Russia had no empire, Christians clung to this view simply because they knew that the Bible was true. Skeptics laughed. It was a joke to think of Russia attacking Israel, a nation that did not exist. And why would Russia be interested in a nothing place like Palestine? No one laughs about that today. After 1948, skeptics retreated behind the word coincidence to explain Israel's rebirth. It was another coincidence that since then the Soviet Union became the dominant world power that the prophets predicted it would. The Soviet-Arab alliance was called yet another coincidence. The excuse for unbelief was wearing thin. "Son of man, set your face toward Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal, Persia, Ethiopia, and Put," that is Libya, "Gomer, and Beth Togarmah." So begins Ezekiel's identification 2,500 years ago of the vast army that would attack a restored Israel in the last days and be destroyed by God's direct intervention, but only after Israel has been severely punished. Magog, Meshech, Tubal, and Gomer were sons of Japheth, the third son of Noah. Their descendants migrated to southern Russia, and Togarmah's descendants to Soviet Armenia. Meshech has been associated with Moscow. Ezekiel's identification is unmistakably clear. Hitler's haunting legacy. Ironically, Hitler's murder of 6 million Jews indirectly created modern Israel. Only the lingering horror of the Nazi extermination camps caused the United Nations to vote the partition of Palestine on November 29, 1947, in spite of war threats by Arab nations. Changing its mind at the last moment, the Soviet bloc unexpectedly cast the deciding vote. As a result, Great Britain, which had been preventing the Jews from immigrating to Palestine, terminated its mandate effective May 15, 1948. These unlikely events combined to fulfill the ancient Hebrew prophecies. Just another coincidence? Hitler's quote-unquote final solution to the Jewish problem also lit a new flame in the hearts of the Jewish people everywhere. Traveling through Europe near the end of the 19th century and warning of coming persecution, Theodor Herzl was able to arouse little Jewish interest in a national homeland. The Holocaust changed that. Of the 2 million Jewish survivors, about half were under the age of 12. Housed in some of the very extermination camps where their families had been murdered, these pitiful remnants of European Jewry were further traumatized by discovering that no nation on earth wanted them. Even the United States and Canada turned deaf ears to their cries. In 1946, for example, America allowed less than 5,000 Jewish refugees to enter its borders. No wonder the conviction grew that a Jewish state would be the only safe haven. Driven by that desperate hope, Holocaust survivors defied the might of Britain, whose Mediterranean blockade, ruthless internment of refugees on Cyprus, and planned forcible return to their camps in Europe could not stem the tide that began to flow into Palestine. Hitler's cruelty had breathed life into the very spirit of Zion that he had been determined to snuff out. As the closing paragraphs in the booklet that one receives upon leaving Yad Vashem, Israeli Memorial to the Holocaust Victims, declare, quote, 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. The very few who had survived and who had returned to their native cities and villages in Eastern Europe were received with anger and hostility. Unwanted in their former homes and weary of a life of tribulation and adversity, Jewish survivors waged a stubborn struggle for the right to immigrate to the land of Israel. They formed the vanguard of the illegal immigration and constituted a powerful force in the political campaign waged for the establishment of an independent state of Israel. In fact, the majority of the survivors reached this country. Here they have made new lives for themselves and their children." Unquote. The irony goes even deeper. Hitler's invasion of Russia set in motion events that transformed the USSR into a great world power capable of launching that attack predicted by the Hebrew prophets. In spite of her great losses, World War II gave Russia everything she needed to pursue her global conquest. 1. The massive military and economic aid supplied by the imperialist United States, its source now conveniently forgotten. 2. The incredibly naive handing over of Eastern Europe by Roosevelt, Truman, Churchill, and Attlee to Stalin after the defeat of Germany. Roosevelt's trusted advisor was Alger Hiss, accused Soviet spy, perjurer, and chief architect of the UN. And 3. A new unity among the Russian people and admiration in the eyes of would-be communists everywhere, through the defeat of Hitler's Wehrmacht. Upon this foundation, which Hitler helped to lay, Soviet communism was able to build a worldwide empire that today threatens the very existence of the Western nations that helped it to survive. No idle threat, quote, "We will bury you," unquote, is just as much the goal of the present Soviet leaders as it was of Khrushchev. And they are no less determined to destroy Israel than Hitler was to exterminate the Jews. Anti-Semitism is official policy in Russia today. Meanwhile, in America, sympathy for Israel has declined sharply, and anti-Semitism is rising again in Europe. Another Holocaust is coming. This is not pessimism, but realism. The Hebrew prophets have predicted it, and they have never yet been wrong. Those who ignore or despise Bible prophecy will one day regret it. Hatred with a certain demonic dimension. Arkady Polishchuk is a Russian Jew born in Moscow. Educated at Moscow University, where he majored in Marxist philosophy, Arkady became a leading Soviet journalist, managing editor of Asia and Africa Today, contributing editor for Izvestia and Pravda, and radio and TV commentator. Disillusioned, he became an active dissident and traveled all over the USSR, documenting Soviet violations of the Helsinki Agreements, particularly persecution of Jews and Christians. He eventually became a Christian himself and is one of the fortunate few to have made it to the West. What he has to say is very instructive. Quote, "Communism was my religion. As a child, my first song was about Lenin, my first poem was about Stalin, and my dream was to become a Communist Party member. I was one for nearly 15 years. That's why it was so difficult for me to get rid of my Marxist ideology, because it was my religion. Isn't it a beautiful idea to build paradise on earth? Communism is the only ideology that promises that. They have been fighting Christianity for 65 years, killing millions of Christians in Soviet camps and prisons. Communism can exist only where no other ideology exists. They have killed other ideologies, but Christianity continues to grow. That is why it's a danger. Since coming to the West, I found out that you Westerners are also brainwashed. Being a liberal here is good. Being a conservative is bad. If you want to put the strongest label on an enemy, you call him a Nazi fascist. You never call him a communist. Yet Stalin killed far more people than Hitler. Every communist society today is based upon power and killing, fear, and brainwashing. top church officials from the Soviet Union come to the West to tell about freedom of religion in Russia. The Soviets use these people as diplomats as part of their propaganda machine to make you believe that there is freedom of conscience in the USSR. As a boy in the streets of Moscow, I was beaten many times for being Jewish. There is real anti-Semitism there. I only got into Moscow University through unusual circumstances. The Soviet Union is the most powerful empire in history. Like any other empire, it must keep growing. That's why they always try to expand into Africa, the Middle East. The Middle East is a very special place for the Soviets, not just because of oil and military strategy, but because of Soviet hatred of Jews. Soviet officials just hate Jews. They want to destroy the state of Israel. There's a certain demonic dimension about this that's impossible to explain." Unquote. Why should there be such hatred against Israel and anyone Jewish? The answer to that question unlocks the whole puzzle of Bible prophecy and the destiny of nations. All of God's promises are inextricably intertwined with Israel's destiny. Destroy Israel, and you have discredited the God of Israel and the Bible. The Messiah had to be born of King David's family, then rejected and crucified by the house of Israel. It was to Jerusalem that the resurrected Savior would return to rescue the Israelis, now back in their homeland and besieged by the armies of the world. Had Satan been able to destroy Israel in time, there would have been no Messiah. He had to come before the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. If Hitler or anyone else before or since could destroy world Jewry, there would be no Israel, no seed of Jacob to return to their land as promised. Without Israel as a nation today, you could throw out the Bible and declare with the Nietzsches that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of the Bible, was dead indeed. That is how important Israel is. Conversely, for those who are willing to face the facts, the very existence of Israel today proves the existence of her God. Moreover, he has greater proof yet to demonstrate in Israel, so that at last all the nations, the unbelieving Israelis included, will know for certain that the God of Israel is the God of history, written in advance. Hitler is dead, but his legacy remains to haunt us all. The almost Antichrist was driven by a demoniacal hatred of anyone or anything Jewish. The real Antichrist will hate Israel even more passionately. That special hatred with a demonic quality already possesses the Soviet leaders. Soon it will lead them to make their greatest blunder, invade Israel. In the meantime, Soviet Jews suffer, and again the world seems to look the other way. This madness betrays itself in strange ways, such as, quote, "A few months ago, the Moscow Jewish kindergarten, the GON, was raided by the KGB. Children were interrogated, left terrified," unquote. Convicted on July 14, 1978, on false charge of treason, his real quote-unquote crime was monitoring Soviet violations of the Helsinki Accords, and sentenced to 13 years in prison, Anatoly Sharansky has become a symbol of Soviet oppression and anti-Semitism. Begging for help, his wife, Avital, writes, quote, "In December 1980, in a Soviet prison camp, Anatoly observed Hanukkah. He dried bread from his daily ration, hardened it, and carved out 8 small indentations. For days he scraped and collected oil from machinery and vehicles. He tore his own clothing to make wicks. Bread, crankcase oil, and cloth, these were his Hanukkah lights. The guards were infuriated. He was sentenced to the special punishment cell for 15 days. His prayer book, a present I sent him, and his Jewish calendar were confiscated. I will tell you what is in my heart. My husband's life or death depends on the whim of the government. They, like all the morally bankrupt, constantly look over their shoulders to see if they are being watched as they commit crimes. Anatoly is but one of the prisoners of conscience in the Soviet Union, one of many whose only crime is a passion for freedom to live as a Jew. You must help them. The Soviets want us to forget the Jews who are trapped, the Jews who suffer in prison camps and jails, the Jews who dream of leaving. You must let the Soviet government know that you are watching." Unquote. The Jewish problem. For many centuries, unbelievers scoffed at the seemingly ridiculous predictions by Hebrew prophets that the climactic battle of world history would one day be fought over Israel, a nation that did not even exist for 2,500 years. No one laughs about Israel now, certainly not the Arabs or Soviets. It is amazing but true that in today's world of 4.6 billion people, the tiny 2.3 million population on a pitifully few square miles of reclaimed swamp and desert, newly reborn nation of Israel has become the great issue that entangles superpowers like a net and drags them ever closer to the brink of destruction, exactly as the Bible predicts. Israel is an astonishing phenomenon. As Marv Rosenthal has said, quote, "Since Israel's rebirth, she has fought 5 wars for national survival in her 34 years, at the same time absorbing more than 2.5 million of her scattered sons and daughters from among more than 100 nations of the world. Military preparedness dictates that almost 50% of her gross national product goes for defense. Experts acknowledge that she ranks 4th in the world in military capability behind the United States, the Soviet Union, and Red China. This is an absolutely astounding statistic. Her pilots possess unique dedication, unsurpassed training, and more combat experience than any pilots in the world. Their achievements are unexcelled in the annals of aviation history. During the past 19 centuries, Jews went unresistingly and lamb-like to their deaths. Those days are gone forever. Today the Jewish nation has become a lion committed to roar if necessary in the defense of her homeland." Unquote. The Hebrew prophets were either egotistical fools blinded by Zionist nationalism, or else they were inspired by God. The fact that their prophecies have been fulfilled one by one in meticulous detail down through the centuries and are still being fulfilled today argues strongly for divine inspiration. What audacity, or what prophetic insight, for Zechariah to declare more than 2,000 years ago that in the last days Jerusalem would become a cup of trembling, a burdensome stone, for the entire world that would eventually cut in pieces all the people of the earth, gathered together against it. It still does not make sense. Why the destiny of the whole world should be so inextricably intertwined with tiny Israel seems as mysterious as the source of Hitler's irresistible power. Yet everyone knows this today by reading the newspapers. How did Israel's prophets know this more than 2,000 years in advance? We had better pay close attention to what they said. What diabolical insight caused Hitler to place such importance upon what he called the Jewish problem? Under that satanic inspiration, the quote-unquote solution he tried to effect was to eliminate the Jews entirely. Yet out of that very slaughter came the rebirth of Israel, thereby resurrecting the Jewish problem and eventually provoking Russia's future attack from the north to drag her into the very destruction of her armed forces that, strangely enough, will finally fulfill Hitler's mad design. The Antichrist's psychotic hatred of Israel will suck him into the same swirling maelstrom of annihilation. It would take more faith to call this all coincidence or fate than to believe that the one true God inspired these prophecies. This does not mean that God's foreknowledge makes him the author of the evils that his prophets predict. Humans have the power of free choice, so the evil they perpetrate, far from being God's fault, is the result of their rebellious abuse of the free will he has given them. That he does not interfere and prevent all evil is not proof of God's impotence or lack of love, but of his patience. He will not break our wills, turning us into robots, for that would destroy our capacity to love or be loved. He seeks to woo us to respond to his love. Nevertheless, he will have the last word, and that day, called the Day of the Lord and the Day of Vengeance of our God, seems to be hastening upon us. Inside Antichrist's New Age Paradise. How will Antichrist solve the Jewish problem? What kind of person will he be, and how will he rule the world? Many evangelical books and films depict him as a monster who simply does evil for the sake of evil. On the contrary, there is every reason to believe that he will inspire his followers as the ultimate example of perfect humanity. At least at first, they will not only worship him as their hero, but love and admire him. And his admirers, millions of New Agers and thousands of network groups around the world, will be sincerely implementing Antichrist's programs in the name of peace, brotherhood, and love. The world will be deluded before it is terrorized, and many people, if not the majority, will never admit the horror and evil that will eventually engulf them all. Antichrist will be the embodiment of evil and terror only to those who recognize who he really is. To all the others, he will embody the perfect realization of New Age philosophies they have believed. He will not sprout horns, dress in red, nor carry a pitchfork. On the contrary, his government methods and personal tactics will be a logical extension and practical application of the very Hindu-Buddhist occult New Age foundation that has been carefully laid over a period of years in preparing the world to recognize and receive the coming world ruler. Many gurus and cult leaders have prepared the way, like John the Baptist did for Jesus, though in a different manner. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi has said in his commentary on the Bhagavad Gita that there is a higher, quote, state of consciousness which will justify any action, even to kill and love, in support of the purpose of evolution, unquote. This state of consciousness is the goal of TM, as it is for all yoga and other Eastern meditation techniques popular in the New Age movement. It is not difficult at all to imagine that Antichrist's faithful followers would exterminate, quote, in love in support of the purpose of evolution, unquote, all those standing in the way of realizing the New Age dream. Long before Maharishi or Jim Jones came along, Brigham Young said basically the same thing from his pulpit in Salt Lake City, quote, "This is loving our neighbor as ourselves. If it is necessary to spill his blood on earth in order that he may be saved, spill it," unquote. Brigham taught that some sins could only be atoned for, not by Jesus Christ, but by the shedding of the sinner's own blood. Antichrist will have as good a justification for mass murder, and his explanations will probably be greeted no less enthusiastically than the Mormons greeted Prophet Young's doctrine of quote-unquote blood atonement, with cheers, applause, and shouts of, "Hear, hear!" Krishna's beautiful advice to Arjuna that it was his duty to kill his relatives is justified in Maharishi's eyes by belief in reincarnation. Charlie Manson justified himself by the same Hindu doctrine, which is an integral part of the quote-unquote ancient wisdom that lies at the foundation of the New Age and will probably be the key tenet of Antichrist's worldwide religion. The bloodbath during the Great Tribulation will make Hitler and Mao seem small time. To those in higher states of consciousness under Antichrist's hypnotic control, the slaughter of millions will not have happened. Christian Scientists and members of other mind science cults will see no evil at all during the entire Great Tribulation, for Antichrist will help them to see only good. To admit that a Holocaust is taking place is to harbor negative thoughts, a heresy in the New Age. One must not allow his mind to be influenced by the delusion of disease or death, much less of murder or other illusions. That the horrors of the Antichrist slaughter of millions of people could be ignored, and that joy could be experienced amidst chaos and destruction by those grooving on higher states of consciousness, is seen in this statement of Eckankar, which is only one of many Eastern mystical cults widely accepted in America today. Quote, "The most distinguishing facet of the Eckist's existence is a sense of joy, a joy which arises from his knowledge that death is a myth, that the word life has a reality that encompasses states of consciousness beyond man's imagination, and the only thing which holds us from the realization of these states is his own self-limiting concepts." Unquote. Strange happenings in Jerusalem. Prophecy can be difficult to interpret in detail. We have not attempted to do that. Instead, we have concentrated upon what seems most clear. Even direct statements, however, present a peculiar picture. There are, for example, those strange street preachers troubling Jerusalem, God's two witnesses who prophesy for 1,260 days clothed in sackcloth. The Antichrist is apparently forced to tolerate them during the first half of the 7-year period because their powers are even greater than his. During this time, Jerusalem is the scene of another paradox. Solomon's temple is being rebuilt, in spite of its unforgivable offense to the Arabs and its total incompatibility with the New World religion. The Israelis feel compelled by tradition to get back to their roots. Oddly enough, the world ruler has given his approval. The project could not proceed without that, and the nations can only watch and wonder. Unknown to the Israelis or anyone else, Antichrist has his own plans for this incredibly beautiful edifice that will settle the Israeli-Arab dispute over Jerusalem once and for all. These first 42 months are a time of expanding prosperity and growing euphoria, and the wealth is being shared. Benjamin Krem says that Maitreya will establish both a world socialist order and a world religion. Antichrist will no doubt follow this part of the plan. The business boom that was in full swing at the time of the rapture will be only briefly interrupted by that shattering event and will accelerate strongly thereafter. Truly, it will seem like the start of a new age that will see humanity solve all problems, conquer all disease, and develop godlike psychic powers. But in the middle of the week, that is, halfway through the 7-year period, Antichrist kills the two witnesses and leaves their bodies to lie in the street in Jerusalem for all the world to see. The startling evidence of a quantum increase in his psychic abilities is that he could finally overcome their incredible powers. Having been tormented by these two Jesus freaks, who for 3.5 years preached an outdated fundamentalism that denied every New Age philosophy, the world is now ecstatic that their hero has finally demonstrated his superiority by killing them. While the world is in the midst of this celebration, Antichrist enters the temple, declares that he is God, and demands that everyone in the world worship him. This is the final blasphemy. The gauntlet has been thrown down, and the Creator will respond to the challenge. God's judgment will soon begin to fall. It is probably at this time that Antichrist demands that everyone take his mark or die. Until now, his power and his throne and great authority were given to him by the dragon, that is, Satan or Lucifer, who has been cast out of heaven and probably personally takes possession of this evil man. Perhaps in his confrontation with the two witnesses, Antichrist suffered the fatal wound that was miraculously healed. His authority to make war with the saints and to overcome them, as he did the two witnesses, could come only from God, and apparently it is this extension of his power and kingdom that is limited to 42 months, that is, until the end of the 7-year period, when Christ returns visibly to earth in judgment. Now the real bloodbath begins, as those who have believed the two witnesses and refused to take the mark and worship Antichrist are hunted down and killed by the millions. Problems in Paradise. Much of Israel feels honored with the unexpected use of the temple for Antichrist worship, now carried on through his image in the temple that speaks, answers questions, and gives orders. Surely no nation would dare attack Jerusalem now. Many Jews are perplexed, however, unhappy that the traditional animal sacrifices have been halted. Remembering the warning that Jesus gave, thousands of Israelis flee to take refuge in nearby mountain strongholds. A momentary wave of fear and confusion sweeps the earth as the two witnesses, after their bodies have lain dead on a Jerusalem street, suddenly return to life and are caught up to heaven. Now the great tribulation begins as God's judgment is poured out upon this earth. Although the book of Revelation seems to depict supernatural acts of God from heaven, no doubt the plagues, at least in part, will result directly from specific evil being practiced upon the earth. For example, genital herpes and its accompanying cervical cancer are related to sexual promiscuity. A cancer-related pneumonia, Kaposi's sarcoma, and other deadly diseases seem to be related directly to homosexuality, yet at the same time they are judgments from God for the violation of His moral laws. Marxism's attempts to construct an atheistic paradise out of inherent human goodness produce their own peculiar judgments: oppression, fear, deceit, slavery, slaughter, and poverty. These same plagues from God will bring an end to the booming prosperity. It is astonishing but true that about 1/3 of Russia's meat, milk, eggs, and vegetables comes from officially approved private plots that account for less than 2% of all farmland. This unbelievable inefficiency factor, which is built into communism, will have an eventual demoralizing effect under Antichrist, contributing to the growing famine and unrest. Occult beliefs and practices also carry severe penalties from God. Man was created to be indwelt by the Holy Spirit, not by unholy demons. Numerous case histories prove the disastrous consequences of yoga, Eastern meditation, spiritism, and other forms of occultism. former followers of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and other gurus have told of demonic possession, being thrown across the room by unknown forces, and moral, mental, and emotional deterioration culminating in self-destruction as a result of the practice of TM and other forms of Eastern meditation and occultism. Nevertheless, under the Antichrist, parapsychology will become the most prestigious science as everyone enthusiastically pursues the holy grail of psychic powers. The accelerating mental, emotional, and moral deterioration will contribute to the eventual disintegration of Antichrist's kingdom, which Revelation describes in terms of God's judgment poured out from heaven. As a result of today's wide acceptance of Eastern mysticism, a worldwide spiritual emergency network with its central registry at the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California, involving more than 4,500 psychologists, healers, and ministers, has been formed to deal with quote-unquote unexpected spiritual emergencies. Marilyn Ferguson's Brain Mind Bulletin explains, quote, loss of body awareness, strange visions, uncontrollable tingling or shaking of the body, attributed to spontaneous release of kundalini energy from the base of the spine, loss of personal boundaries, leaving one uncertain where the body ends and the rest of the world begins. Such experiences are common among people involved in yoga, meditation, and other spiritual disciplines. The network's 24-hour answering service is available for immediate counseling, which begins with a welcome to the club talk, assurance that the caller's experience is not unique or crazy. In the future, Rowan said, most people may have such experiences, unquote. Network coordinator Rita Rowan's prediction will certainly come true following the universal Luciferic initiation. Under Antichrist, an accelerating moral, mental, and emotional deterioration of mankind will unravel personalities and undermine the New Age, exposing the lie, for those able to see, upon which its seemingly perfect peace and prosperity have been built. Most of humanity, however, will be under such a strong delusion that they will continue to pursue their own godhood in hope of gaining powers like Antichrist's. The occult bondage will lead to deepening depravity, erratic behavior, fits of uncontrollable rage, murder, riots, all related to the plagues that Revelation describes as God's judgment being poured out upon the earth. Finally, everyone will become suicidal, but will be unable to take their own lives to escape the awful consequences of their madness. Having undergone a Luciferic initiation, which is tantamount to demon possession, the Antichrist's followers will openly worship not only him, but Satan. Quote, they worship the dragon because he gave his authority to the beast, unquote. Satan will give enough psychic power to the masses to lead them on, and the epidemic of deteriorating personalities, which will reach frightening proportions, will be shrugged off at first as the momentary side effects of great scientific advancement. Quantum leaps do not come easily. However, as spreading neuroses, famine, and disease dissolve the euphoria, Antichrist's total control over the world will begin to unravel at the edges. Disillusioned humanity will look for a scapegoat. As always, it will turn out to be the Jews. The final solution. Today, anti-Semitism is on the rise worldwide. It will accelerate rapidly during the second half of the 7-year period. The progressing demonization of the human race will produce its inevitable fruit, one final attempt to destroy the Jewish state. Although disarmament may have been agreed upon and may even be in process, the world's powers will still have the bulk of their weapons. Like Hitler, the world's demented leaders will be convinced that all of humanity's ills can be traced to the Jews. Plans will be carefully laid for a final solution to the Jewish problem. Led by the eager Soviet Union, the world's major powers invade Israel from all sides. Although the Israelis fight heroically and inflict heavy losses, they are overwhelmed. At that point, the well-planned campaign becomes an unimaginable free-for-all. The mutual hatred which the Soviets, Arabs, Europeans, and Chinese have so long nourished for each other betrays itself as soon as it appears that the Israelis are going down in defeat. Abruptly, the invading armies turn the full force of their arms upon each other in Israel's valley of Jezreel. Armageddon has come at last. The battle is not confined to Israel's soil. Nuclear missiles are unleashed by each of the 4 invading factions against the other's homelands. Charles Fillmore, co-founder of the Unity School of Christianity, said, quote, "Whatever appears in your objective world is an image made by your own thoughts. You can change an appearance by changing your thoughts," unquote. And other Hindu-Buddhist philosophies that have been accepted as the new science in the Antichrist kingdom will be hard-pressed to affirm Unity's teaching of the total unreality of evil in that day of unprecedented death and destruction. The horror of this Holocaust defies description. Jesus said, "Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved." To prevent the extermination of all life on earth, Jesus Christ suddenly returns to the Mount of Olives, accompanied by the armies of heaven. Neither psychic power from Satan nor the most sophisticated and fearsome weapons of war are a match for the real Messiah. This time he does not come meekly as a lamb to be crucified in our place, but as the Lion of the tribe of Judah, taking vengeance. It will not be rumored that he is hiding high in the Himalayas or has come down to a Hindu-Pakistani community in southeast London, as Benjamin Krem has said of his Christ Maitreya. Jesus said of his appearing, "For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be." John wrote, "Every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn over him." And Zechariah quotes Jehovah himself, making this astonishing statement, "They will look on me whom they have pierced, and they will mourn for him, as one mourns for an only son." The devout Israeli who waits today for the Messiah must honestly ask himself when his Messiah was pierced. And the Jehovah's Witness must ask himself when his Jehovah was pierced. It is clear from Zechariah's statement above that Jehovah, me, and the Messiah who was pierced, him, are one and the same God. As Jesus said, "I and the Father are one," not merely in purpose, but in essence. The Hebrew word translated pierced carries a stronger meaning than the piercing of hands and feet with the nails of crucifixion. It means piercing to death, and must therefore refer to the spear wound in Jesus' side. Wounds in hands and feet might be faked, so the prophet made it clear that the one who would come to rescue Israel was once dead and has been resurrected. This is obviously not Krishna, Buddha, Muhammad, or any other alleged reincarnation of the Christ spirit. It can only be Jesus himself. The greatest mourning in its history will begin as Israel realizes that for all these centuries, just as the prophet Isaiah warned they would, Jews have rejected and despised the very one who is their Redeemer. The remnant of Israel that survives will repent, and a nation will be born again in a day. Separating the sheep from the goats, the Lord will judge those Gentiles who are left alive on earth for the way they have treated the Jewish people. Those who pass this test, plus all of Israel, will enter the Millennium together. With Jesus reigning in Jerusalem and resurrected believers governing under him throughout the world, real peace will be established at last. But at what a cost? Hitler was the almost Antichrist, but not because that devil of a man was only a dress rehearsal. The powers of darkness tried desperately to fulfill the plan through the Führer and almost succeeded. They were restrained from their full purpose because God's time had not yet come. Hitler was used, however, to restore Israel to her land and to turn Russia into a world power, setting the stage for the Antichrist's final solution to the Jewish problem. The rapture will remove both the church and the restraining influence of the Holy Spirit that has worked through those millions of believers. Thereafter, everything will move with precision and without further restraint from God to fulfill all that his prophets have spoken. The prophets have warned us. They have also told us how to escape, and thereby made us responsible for rescuing not only ourselves, but others. Francis Schaeffer has said, quote, "The world quite properly looks back to the church in Germany during the early days of Hitler's rise and curses it for not doing something when something could have been done." Unquote. The church in Germany was not just blind, but willfully blind. Are we? Will someone look back and properly curse us for not doing what we could and should have done? A way of escape is offered to those who will take it. Time is not yet run out. Soon it will. How soon, no one knows.